In the scorching Arizona desert of 1885, where the sun could kill a person as surely as any bullet, the U.S. Army made a decision that would haunt them forever. They took a young woman who had witnessed something she shouldn't have seen, something that could destroy powerful men's careers, and they handed her over to the most feared Apache tracker in the territory. This wasn't justice. This wasn't mercy. This was murder with clean hands. The officials told themselves they were being clever. Send her to Nailnish, they said. The Apache blood hunter who could track a whisper across stone and find water where others found only death. He was known for one thing above all others: he never brought anyone back alive who was meant to disappear. But, sometimes, in the vast emptiness of the desert, the most hardened hearts discover something they never expected to find. Sometimes the hunter becomes the protector. Sometimes the condemned becomes the one worth dying for. This is the true story of how a death sentence became a love story, and how two people from different worlds found something worth fighting for in the most unforgiving place on earth. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison had always been told that curiosity would be her downfall, but she never imagined it would literally lead to her death. The 23-year-old schoolteacher from Boston had come to Fort Apache in the Arizona Territory with dreams of bringing education to the frontier. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone raised in proper society, her auburn hair always neatly pinned, her modest dresses pressed despite the desert heat. But, beneath her refined exterior burned an intelligence that refused to be contained by social expectations. The trouble began on a Tuesday evening in September 1885, when Sarah decided to take her usual walk around the fort's perimeter. The commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Whitmore, had repeatedly warned civilians about venturing out alone after dark, but Sarah had grown comfortable with the routine. She enjoyed the quiet moments when the desert cooled and the stars emerged like scattered diamonds across the vast sky. The fort felt suffocating with its constant noise and masculine energy. These evening walks were her escape, her time to think and plan lessons for the children who looked up to her with such eager eyes. As she rounded the corner near the officers' quarters, Sarah heard voices coming from Colonel Whitmore's office. The window was slightly open to catch the evening breeze, and the conversation drifted out into the night air. She wouldn't have paid attention, except she recognized the second voice. It belonged to Thomas Brennan, a wealthy cattle baron who had visited the fort several times in recent months. His presence always made her uncomfortable. He looked at her with the kind of predatory interest that made her skin crawl. What she heard next made her blood run cold. The Apache raids on the reservation are getting out of hand, Brennan was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. We need to move faster with our plans. Every day we wait is money lost. Colonel Whitmore's response was barely audible, but Sarah caught enough words to understand. The government inspector arrives next month. If he discovers what we've been doing with the supply shipments. He won't discover anything if there's nobody left to tell him, Brennan interrupted. These Apache uprisings give us the perfect cover. A few more raids, a few more casualties, and Washington will authorize the removal we've been pushing for. The land will be opened for development, just as we planned. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were talking about deliberately provoking Apache attacks on the reservation. They were discussing the deaths of innocent people as if they were planning a business transaction. The federal supplies meant for the Apache families were being diverted and sold, leaving the tribe desperate and angry. When they lashed out in hunger and frustration, Brennan and Whitmore used those incidents to justify their calls for forced relocation. She pressed herself against the building's wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it. Through the window, she could see Colonel Whitmore pouring whiskey into 2 glasses. His usually immaculate uniform was wrinkled, and his face showed the strain of whatever dark business he was conducting. The territorial governor is asking questions, Whitmore continued. Senator Morrison's daughter teaching at the fort has brought unwanted attention. Her father has connections in Washington. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her. Her father, Senator James Morrison, had indeed used his influence to secure her teaching position, believing the frontier experience would cure her of what he called her romantic notions about helping others. Then, perhaps it's time Miss Morrison had an unfortunate encounter with some hostile Apache, Brennan suggested, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. Tragic, really. A young woman venturing too far from the safety of the fort. These things happen on the frontier. Sarah had heard enough. She backed away from the window, her legs trembling beneath her skirts. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The fort was surrounded by miles of unforgiving desert, and, beyond that lay Apache territory. She was trapped between the men who wanted her dead and a wilderness that could kill her just as effectively. She made it back to her small quarters in the teacher's building without being seen, but sleep was impossible. Her mind raced as she tried to process what she had learned. Colonel Whitmore, the man responsible for protecting the very people he was helping to destroy, was corrupt beyond anything she had imagined. And Thomas Brennan, with his expensive suits and political connections, was orchestrating the suffering of an entire tribe for financial gain. The next morning brought confirmation that her fears were justified. During breakfast in the officers' mess, Colonel Whitmore announced that Miss Morrison would be accompanying a scouting party to inspect conditions at the Apache reservation. It was presented as an educational opportunity, a chance for her to see firsthand the challenges facing the territory's original inhabitants. "I've arranged for our best tracker to guide the expedition," Whitmore said, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "Nailnish knows the desert better than any white man. He'll ensure your safety, Miss Morrison." The other officers exchanged glances that Sarah didn't miss. She had heard whispers about Nailnish around the fort. He was Apache by birth but had been working with the army for several years as a tracker and scout. The soldiers spoke of him with a mixture of respect and fear. They said he could find water in places where others saw only death, that he could track a man across solid rock, and that he had never failed to bring back whoever he was sent to find. They also said he had never brought anyone back alive when they weren't supposed to return. Sarah spent the day trying to think of a way out of the situation. She considered sending a telegraph to her father, but the telegraph office was controlled by the army, and any message would pass through Colonel Whitmore's hands. She thought about confessing what she had overheard to one of the other officers, but how could she know who was trustworthy? The corruption might run deeper than just Whitmore. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah made her decision. She would go on this expedition, but she would be ready. She packed her few precious belongings into a small bag that she could carry easily. Her grandmother's ring, the only photograph she had of her deceased mother, and the journal where she recorded her thoughts and experiences. If she was going to die in the desert, at least there would be some record of what she had discovered. The evening brought another shock. As she prepared for bed, Sarah heard footsteps outside her window. She peered through the curtains and saw Thomas Brennan himself approaching the building. Her breath caught in her throat as he stopped directly outside her quarters and spoke in a low voice to someone she couldn't see. "Make sure she doesn't come back," Brennan said. "And make it look convincing. Apache raids are becoming too common for anyone to question another casualty." A voice responded from the shadows, and Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized Colonel Whitmore's tone. "Nailnish has his instructions. Miss Morrison will encounter a group of hostile Apache somewhere in the deep desert. Tragic, but these things happen. Her body may never be found." Sarah sank onto her bed, the full weight of her situation pressing down on her like a physical force. They weren't just planning to have her killed. They were planning to blame her death on the very people she now understood were victims of these men's greed. The Apache would bear the responsibility for another murder they didn't commit, giving Brennan and Whitmore more justification for their bloody plans. She thought about her students, the children who looked forward to their lessons and trusted her to teach them about the world beyond their desert home. She thought about the Apache families struggling to survive on inadequate supplies while their allocated provisions were sold for profit. She thought about all the innocent people who would suffer if these corrupt men weren't stopped. But how could one schoolteacher from Boston fight against such powerful enemies? She had no weapons, no allies she could trust, and no experience with the harsh realities of frontier life. Her education and good intentions seemed pathetically inadequate against the brutal practicality of men like Brennan and Whitmore. The night passed slowly, filled with restless turning and troubled dreams. When dawn finally broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Sarah rose and dressed carefully. If this was to be her last day, she would face it with whatever dignity she could muster. The scouting party assembled near the fort's main gate as the morning heat began to build. Colonel Whitmore was there to see them off, playing his part perfectly as the concerned commanding officer, ensuring the safety of a distinguished visitor. Several soldiers would accompany the expedition, along with a civilian guide Sarah didn't recognize. And then she saw him. Nelnish stood apart from the others, his presence somehow commanding attention without any obvious effort. He was not as tall as she had expected, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches, but he carried himself with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his environment. His features were sharp and angular, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His black hair was cut shorter than traditional Apache style, hanging just past his shoulders, and he wore a mixture of white man's clothing and native elements that somehow looked completely natural on him. What struck Sarah most was his absolute stillness. While the soldiers fidgeted with their equipment and made nervous conversation, Nelnish simply waited. He was like a part of the landscape itself, patient and enduring. When Colonel Whitmore approached him with final instructions, Sarah strained to hear their conversation, but they spoke too quietly. She watched Nelnish's face as Whitmore talked, looking for any sign of the bloodthirsty killer she had been told to expect. Instead, she saw only careful attention and what might have been resignation. When the colonel finished speaking and walked away, Nelnish's dark gaze found hers across the assembled group. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah felt a strange shock of recognition. Not that she had seen him before, but something deeper. In his steady gaze, she saw intelligence, strength, and something else that surprised her. She saw sadness. Then, the moment passed, and Nelnish was checking the supplies and preparing for departure. Sarah climbed onto the horse that had been assigned to her, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. She had learned to ride during her childhood summers at her uncle's estate, but this would be far different from those gentle excursions through manicured countryside. As the small expedition rode through the fort's gates and into the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert, Sarah Morrison carried with her the knowledge that she was riding toward her own execution. The man who led them, this Apache tracker named Nelnish, had been paid to ensure she never returned to tell what she had heard. But, as the fort grew smaller behind them and the desert stretched endlessly ahead, Sarah began to notice things that gave her pause. Nelnish rode with the unconscious grace of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape, but he also kept glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When her horse stumbled slightly on the rocky ground, he immediately slowed the pace without being asked. These were not the actions of a man eager to complete a killing. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build toward its daily crescendo, Sarah found herself studying the man who held her life in his hands. There was something about Nelnish that didn't match the stories she had heard. Something that suggested her understanding of this situation might be as incomplete as everything else she had believed about life on the frontier. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of stone and sand, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Somewhere out there, among the ancient rocks and hidden canyons, her fate would be decided. But, for the first time since overhearing that terrible conversation, Sarah Morrison began to wonder if death was truly inevitable. Perhaps, in this vast wilderness where the rules of civilization seemed as distant as the eastern city she had left behind, other possibilities existed. Perhaps the man leading this expedition was not quite what he seemed to be. And, perhaps, just perhaps, she might find a way to survive long enough to expose the corruption that threatened so many innocent lives. The desert sun climbed higher, promising another day of brutal heat and unforgiving beauty. Sarah Morrison rode deeper into the wilderness, carrying hope like a secret flame in her heart. Nelnish had killed 17 men in his 32 years of life, and he remembered every face. Some had been enemies who threatened his people. Others had been fugitives who chose to fight rather than surrender. A few had been corrupt officials who thought their positions made them untouchable. But never had he been asked to kill an innocent woman, and never had he felt the weight of refusal so heavily on his shoulders. the Apache tracker whose white name was Joseph Crowfeather but whose true name meant he who sees in darkness had been walking a dangerous line between two worlds for the past 5 years. When his band had been forced onto the reservation, when the promised government supplies failed to arrive month after month, when children began to starve while agents sold their food to line their own pockets, Nailnish had made a choice that still haunted his dreams. He had offered his services to the U.S. Army as a scout and tracker, not out of loyalty to the white soldiers, but because it gave him access to information his people desperately needed. Every expedition he guided, every criminal he tracked, every mission he completed bought him credibility with men like Colonel Whitmore. That credibility had allowed him to occasionally redirect supply convoys toward the reservation, to warn Apache families of planned raids, and to gather intelligence about the government's true intentions toward his people. It was a deadly game, and Nailnish knew that discovery meant death not just for him, but for many others who depended on the information he provided. He had built his reputation as a ruthless tracker who never failed to complete his assignments because that reputation was the only thing keeping him alive and effective. The white soldiers feared him just enough to respect him, and that fear gave him the freedom to operate. But now Colonel Whitmore had crossed a line that even Nailnish's carefully constructed persona couldn't accommodate. 3 days ago, the colonel had summoned him to a private meeting and laid out the assignment in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. Miss Sarah Morrison, the senator's daughter teaching at the fort, had become a liability. She had discovered something she shouldn't have, and she needed to disappear in a way that wouldn't raise questions in Washington. Make it look like an Apache raid, Whitmore had ordered, sliding a leather pouch across his desk. The heavy clink of gold coins inside made Nailnish's stomach turn. Take her deep into the desert, somewhere remote. Leave evidence that hostile Apache found her. Scatter some arrows around, maybe leave one of those bone ornaments your people are so fond of. Make it convincing. Nailnish had taken the gold because refusing would have meant immediate suspicion and death. But, as he rode out from Fort Apache with Sarah Morrison and 2 soldiers who had been told they were conducting a routine inspection of the reservation, his mind was racing through possibilities. He could kill the soldiers and let the woman go, but she would never survive the desert alone, and her eventual death would accomplish Whitmore's goal anyway. He could take her to his Apache contacts, but that would expose the network he had spent years building and doom dozens of families. Or he could do something that went against every survival instinct he had developed. He could trust her. As the small expedition made its way deeper into the Sonoran Desert, Nailnish found himself studying the woman riding behind him. Sarah Morrison was not what he had expected. Most white women who came to the territory fell into one of 2 categories: those who were overwhelmed by the harsh conditions and spent their time complaining, and those who tried to impose their Eastern sensibilities on a landscape that cared nothing for their expectations. But Sarah Morrison rode with quiet determination, never complaining despite the obvious discomfort of the heat and unfamiliar terrain. When her horse stumbled on loose stone, she steadied herself without dramatic displays or demands for assistance. When the water breaks became necessary, she rationed her intake carefully, understanding without being told that water was precious in this environment. More importantly, Nailnish noticed how she looked at the land around them. Where most whites saw only desolation and danger, Sarah's eyes showed wonder at the strange beauty of the desert. She watched the hawks circling overhead with genuine interest rather than fear. When a roadrunner darted between the creosote bushes, she smiled with the same delight he had seen in Apache children encountering the desert's small miracles. These observations might have been enough to make him reconsider his assignment, but it was something else that truly changed his mind. During their midday rest in the shade of a towering saguaro cactus, one of the soldiers made a crude comment about Apache women. The words were spoken quietly, meant only for his companion's ears, but Nailnish heard them clearly. What surprised him was Sarah Morrison's reaction. Her face flushed with anger, and she turned toward the soldiers with fire in her green eyes. "That's quite enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling unruly children. "You will speak respectfully of all people, regardless of their race, or you will not speak at all in my presence." The soldiers looked stunned. They were accustomed to the casual racism that pervaded frontier military posts, where Apache were routinely referred to in terms that questioned their humanity. Having a proper Eastern lady defend them was beyond their experience. "Now see here, miss," one of them began, but Sarah cut him off. "I see perfectly well," she replied. "I see men who have forgotten their manners and their duty to treat all people with basic human dignity. If you cannot remember those lessons, perhaps you should reflect on them in silence." The soldiers fell quiet, more from confusion than conviction, but Sarah's message had been delivered clearly. Nailnish, who had been preparing to intervene in his own way, found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about this woman. As the afternoon wore on and the heat became almost unbearable, Nailnish made his decision. When they made camp that evening at a small oasis he knew well, he would send the soldiers away on a fabricated errand and tell Sarah Morrison the truth about why she was really in the desert. It was a massive risk, one that could destroy everything he had built, but something about her defense of his people had convinced him that she might be different from the other whites he had encountered. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they reached Tahana Wells, a hidden spring that had sustained travelers for countless generations. The soldiers were grateful for the shade and water after the punishing heat of the day, and they settled into the comfortable routine of making camp with the casual assumption that they were in charge of the expedition. Nailnish let them maintain that illusion while he watered the horses and studied the surrounding terrain. The oasis was perfect for his purposes, isolated enough to ensure privacy but with multiple escape routes if things went wrong. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rocks around the spring, testament to the countless people who had found shelter here over the centuries. As the soldiers prepared their evening meal, Nailnish approached Sarah, who was sitting apart from the others, writing in a small leather journal. Her dedication to recording her experiences struck him as both admirable and tragic, since he had been hired to ensure those experiences ended permanently. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." She looked up from her writing, and he saw wariness in her green eyes. She wasn't naive about the dangers of her situation, despite her composed exterior. "Of course," she replied, closing the journal and following him to a spot near the spring where the sound of running water would mask their conversation. Nailnish had rehearsed this moment during the long, hot hours of writing, but now that it was here, he found himself struggling for words. "How did you tell someone that they had been sentenced to death? How did you explain that their own government had decided they were expendable?" "You are not safe," he began simply. "This expedition is not what you were told." Sarah's face went pale, but she didn't seem surprised. "I was afraid of that," she said quietly. "I overheard a conversation between Colonel Whitmore and Thomas Brennan 3 nights ago. They were discussing the diversion of Apache supplies and something about removing the tribe from the reservation." Nailnish felt a surge of respect for her intelligence and courage. She had figured out at least part of the conspiracy on her own. "They know you heard them," he said. "Colonel Whitmore hired me to ensure you never return to the fort. He wants your death to look like an Apache raid, to give him more justification for his plans." Sarah nodded slowly, as if this confirmation of her fears brought relief rather than terror. "And you agreed to kill me for them?" It wasn't a question, and Nailnish appreciated her directness. "I took their gold," he admitted. "But I will not take your life." "Why?" Sarah asked, studying his face in the fading light. "From what I've heard, you've never failed to complete an assignment." Nailnish considered his answer carefully. How could he explain the complex web of loyalties and deceptions that had brought him to this moment? How could he make her understand that sometimes the only way to serve justice was to work within a corrupt system? "Because killing you would serve the same men who are starving my people," he said finally. "Because you spoke in defense of Apache women when those soldiers insulted them. Because I have seen how you look at this land, and you see beauty where others see only emptiness." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was steady despite the gravity of their situation. "What happens now? If you don't kill me, they'll know you disobeyed orders. You'll be in as much danger as I am." Nailnish had been considering that very problem all afternoon. "There is a way," he said. "But it will require you to trust me completely, and it will mean giving up your old life forever." "My old life is already over," Sarah replied with surprising calm. "The moment I overheard that conversation, Sarah Morrison the schoolteacher ceased to exist.
The question is whether I can become someone else, someone who can help stop what they're planning."
Her words confirmed what Nailnish had hoped to hear. This woman had the strength and intelligence to survive what he was about to propose. More than that, she had the moral courage to put the welfare of others ahead of her own safety.
"We stage your death," he explained.
"Tomorrow, we send the soldiers back to the fort with evidence that you were killed by Apache raiders.
Your clothes, torn and bloodied. Some of your personal belongings, scattered as if dropped during a struggle. They will report that they found your body too late to save you, that the Apache had already taken it away." "And where will I actually be?"
"With me," Nailnish said simply. "Living among my people, learning their ways, helping to gather evidence against Whitmore and Brennan."
"It will not be easy.
The desert is harsh, and not all Apache will welcome a white woman, even one who has been condemned by her own people." Sarah looked out over the desert landscape, painted in shades of orange and purple by the setting sun. Somewhere out there lay a life completely different from anything she had ever imagined. It would mean abandoning everything familiar, embracing a culture she barely understood, and probably never seeing her family again. "When do we begin?" she asked. That night, as the soldiers slept and the desert settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Nailnish and Sarah worked quietly to prepare for their deception. They tore her spare dress and stained it with animal blood from Nailnish's hunting supplies. They scattered some of her jewelry and personal items in a pattern that suggested a violent struggle. Most painfully, Sarah tore pages from her journal and left them partially burned in the ashes of their campfire, as if Apache raiders had destroyed her final written words. As dawn approached, Nailnish prepared to implement the most dangerous part of their plan. He would take the soldiers to a canyon several miles away, or he would show them the staged evidence of Sarah's death. While they examined the scene, he would slip away and return for Sarah, but the timing had to be perfect. If the soldiers became suspicious and followed him back to the oasis, both he and Sarah would die.
"Are you certain about this?" he asked her one final time as the sky began to lighten in the east. "Once we begin, there will be no going back. You will be dead to everyone you have ever known."
Sarah looked at him with steady eyes that showed no trace of doubt. "I've been thinking about what you said, about seeing beauty where others see emptiness. I think the same could be said about seeing hope where others see only despair. If there's a chance to stop Whitmore and Brennan, to save innocent people from their greed, then that's worth any sacrifice." Nailnish felt something shift in his chest as he looked at this remarkable woman who was willing to give up everything to fight injustice. He had spent years building walls around his emotions, protecting himself from caring too deeply about anyone who might become a liability. But Sarah Morrison was demolishing those walls without even trying. "Then, we begin," he said. "And may the spirits of this place guide us both." As the sun rose over the desert and the soldiers began to stir in their bedrolls, Nailnish prepared to embark on the most dangerous deception of his life. He was about to convince two armed soldiers that the woman they had been escorting was dead, while she hid nearby waiting for his return. Everything depended on his ability to sell a lie that would satisfy Colonel Whitmore while protecting the one person who might be able to expose the corruption destroying both their peoples. The morning air was still cool, but Nailnish could already feel the heat building for another punishing day. By evening, either his plan would have succeeded and Sarah Morrison would be beginning her new life among the Apache, or they would both be dead in the unforgiving embrace of the Sonoran Desert. But, as he looked at Sarah's determined face in the growing light, Nailnish realized that for the first time in years, he was fighting for something more than mere survival. He was fighting for hope itself, and that made all the difference. The deception began at dawn with a carefully orchestrated tragedy that never happened. Nailnish woke the soldiers with urgent whispers about tracking signs he had discovered near the water source. He led them away from the oasis before the sun had fully risen, following a path that would take them through a narrow canyon where ancient flash floods had carved dramatic walls from red sandstone. Sarah remained hidden among the rocks near the spring, her heart pounding as she listened to the soldiers' voices fade into the distance. The canyon Nailnish had chosen was perfect for his purposes. The rocky ground would show minimal tracks, but, more importantly, it contained a small cave where he had previously cached supplies for emergencies. Inside that cave, along with water and dried meat, were items that would complete the illusion of Sarah's death.
Look at this, he called to the soldiers, pointing to scratches he had made in the dirt before dawn. Unshod pony tracks. At least 6 riders, maybe more. The soldiers examined the marks with the careful attention of men who knew their lives might depend on reading such signs correctly. Private Williams, the older of the two, had served in Apache country long enough to recognize the deliberate patterns raiders used when moving quickly. They're heading deeper into the Badlands, he observed. Probably a war party moving between hideouts. Nailnish nodded grimly. Miss Morrison's horse showed signs of lameness yesterday evening. If they caught her alone while we were gathering firewood. He let the implication hang in the air while leading them deeper into the canyon. Around the next bend, he had prepared the scene that would convince them of Sarah's fate. Her torn dress was caught on a thorny ocotillo bush, stained with blood from a rabbit Nailnish had killed before dawn. Nearby, her small leather purse lay partially buried in sand, its contents scattered as if dropped during a struggle. Sweet Jesus, Private Williams breathed, recognizing the dress immediately. They got her. The younger soldier, barely 19 and, fresh from a posting in Ohio, turned pale at the sight. Where's the body? Nailnish shook his head with the practiced grimness of someone who had seen too much violence. Apache don't always leave bodies behind. Sometimes they take captives back to their strongholds. He paused deliberately. Sometimes it's better if we don't find what's left. The implication was clear and horrible. Both soldiers had heard stories about what happened to white women captured by hostile Apache. The stories were largely exaggerated, products of fear and racism, but they served Nailnish's purpose now. We have to search for her, the younger soldier insisted. She might still be alive. Nailnish gestured toward the maze of canyons stretching endlessly into the distance. 6 Apache warriors with at least a 4-hour head start, moving through country they know better than their own names? We would be dead before we found anything, and Miss Morrison would still be lost. Private Williams, who had the practical experience to know Nailnish was right, made the decision. We take what evidence we can carry and report back to the colonel. He'll decide whether to send out a larger search party. They gathered the torn dress and the scattered contents of Sarah's purse, along with one of her hair ribbons that Nailnish had strategically placed near what appeared to be horse tracks. The younger soldier wanted to continue searching, but Williams overruled him with the harsh logic of frontier survival. 6 Apache warriors, he repeated. We're not soldiers on patrol, we're an escort mission that's already failed. Our duty now is to get back alive and report what happened. As they made their way back toward where they had left their horses, Nailnish allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. The soldiers had bought the deception completely. They would return to Fort Apache with physical evidence of Sarah's death and a story that fit perfectly with Colonel Whitmore's expectations. But the most dangerous part of the plan was yet to come. After seeing the soldiers safely on their way back to the fort, Nailnish had to return to Sarah and begin the next phase of their desperate gamble. He had to transform a refined Eastern schoolteacher into someone who could survive in Apache territory, and he had to do it quickly enough to stay ahead of any search parties Whitmore might send to verify the story. When he finally made it back to Tahano Wells, the sun was approaching its daily crescendo of heat. Sarah was waiting exactly where he had left her, hidden among the rocks but alert to his return. The relief on her face when she saw him alone was unmistakable. It worked, she asked as he approached her hiding place. They believed what they saw, Nailnish confirmed. By tonight, Colonel Whitmore will think you are dead. But now the real work begins. He had brought supplies from his cache in the canyon, including clothes that would help Sarah blend into her new environment. The long skirts and tight bodices that marked her as a respectable Eastern lady had to be abandoned in favor of practical garments better suited to desert survival. These belonged to a Mexican woman who died of fever last winter, he explained, handing her a bundle of clothes. She was about your size. The Apache who found her brought these to me because they thought the white soldiers might want them for their women. Sarah examined the simple cotton dress and leather vest with practical eyes. They're much more sensible than what I'd been wearing, she admitted. But won't other Apache recognize them as belonging to someone else? Apache understand that clothes are for the living, Nailnish replied.
Wearing a dead person's garments honors their memory by ensuring the items serve a useful purpose. As Sarah changed into her new clothes behind a screen of rocks, Nailnish prepared for the next challenge. They couldn't stay at Tahano Wells much longer. It was too close to the area where the soldiers thought she had died, and there was always a chance that someone might come looking for additional evidence. They needed to reach the hidden camp where Nailnish's contacts lived, but the journey would take them deep into territory that few whites had ever seen and fewer had survived. When Sarah emerged from her improvised dressing area, Nailnish was struck by how the simple clothes transformed her appearance. The practical dress and vest made her look less like a displaced Easterner and more like someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. Her auburn hair, freed from its usual tight pins, caught the light with copper highlights that seemed to echo the colors of the desert stone around them. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pack. "You'll need a new name. Sarah Morrison is dead, and she can never return. Who do you want to become?" Sarah considered the question with the same serious attention she had given to everything else about their situation. "I've been thinking about that," she said finally. "My grandmother's name was Elena. She was Spanish, from California when it still belonged to Mexico. She always said she felt more at home in wild places than in drawing rooms." "Elena," Nailnish repeated, testing how the name sounded. "It's a good name. Strong but not unusual enough to draw attention." "Elena Sandoval," Sarah said, using her grandmother's maiden name. "A woman with Mexican heritage traveling through Apache territory wouldn't be as remarkable as a missing senator's daughter." Nailnish nodded approvingly. She was thinking like someone who understood the need for careful deception. "Can you speak Spanish?" "Some," Elena replied, unconsciously slipping into her new identity. "My grandmother insisted I learn, even though my parents thought it was inappropriate. She said a woman should be able to speak to as many different people as possible." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She used to tell me stories about living on a ranch in California before the Americans came. She said the desert wasn't empty, it was just waiting for people smart enough to listen to what it was trying to teach them." As they prepared to leave Tahano Wells, Nailnish found himself impressed once again by Elena's adaptability. She had already begun to move differently, with less of the rigid posture that marked her as Eastern educated and more of the fluid awareness that desert dwellers developed naturally. She paid attention to sounds and shadows, learning to read the environment around her. The journey to the hidden camp would take 3 days if they traveled carefully, avoiding the main trails and water sources where they might encounter soldiers or hostile Apache who wouldn't understand Elena's presence. Nailnish had made this trip dozens of times, but never with a companion who represented such a dramatic risk to everyone involved. The Apache band they were approaching lived in deliberate isolation, survivors of conflicts with both Mexican and American authorities who had chosen to maintain their traditional ways rather than accept reservation life. They tolerated Nailnish's presence because he brought valuable information and occasionally diverted useful supplies in their direction, but they remained deeply suspicious of all whites. Bringing Elena to their camp would require careful negotiation and absolute trust in his judgment. If the band's leaders decided she represented a threat, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate that threat permanently. Nailnish's reputation would protect him, but it might not be enough to save her. As they began their journey deeper into the maze of canyons and mesas that formed the heart of Apache country, Elena asked the question he had been expecting. "What will you tell them about me? Your people, I mean. How do you explain bringing a white woman to their hiding place?" Nailnish had been considering that problem since he first decided to trust her. "I will tell them the truth," he said simply. "That you discovered the corruption that threatens all Apache, that your own people condemned you for trying to help mine, and that you have chosen to fight alongside us rather than remain silent." "And if they don't believe you?" "Then, we will both die," Nailnish replied with characteristic directness. "But I think they will listen. The elders remember when whites and Apache lived in peace, before the soldiers came with their promises and their lies. They know that not all whites are the same, just as not all Apache are the same." Elena absorbed this information without visible fear, though Nailnish knew she had to be terrified. Everything about her situation violated the social rules she had been raised to follow. She was traveling alone with a man from a different race, abandoning her family and social position, and preparing to live among people most whites considered savage enemies. But, as they rode deeper into the wilderness, following paths that existed more in Nailnish's memory than in any visible trail, Elena continued to surprise him with her adaptability. She learned to read the desert's rhythms, understanding when to conserve water and when they could afford to drink more freely. She recognized the plants that offered edible seeds or roots, and she began to move with the quiet efficiency that marked experienced desert travelers. Most importantly, she asked intelligent questions about Apache culture and customs, preparing herself for the encounter that would determine whether she lived or died. She wanted to know about proper greetings, about the social structure of Apache bands, about the spiritual beliefs that shaped their relationship with the land. The most important thing to understand, Nailnish explained as they made camp on their second night, is that Apache culture values actions over words. They will judge you not by what you say, but by what you do. Show respect for their ways, contribute what you can to the group, and prove that you understand the importance of protecting the band's security.
And if they decide I'm not worth the risk?
Nailnish looked at her across the small fire they had built in a hidden alcove between two massive boulders. In the flickering light, she looked like someone who had always belonged to the desert, her face marked by sun and wind but still showing the determination that had brought her this far.
Then, I will stand with you, he said quietly. Your fate is tied to mine now. Elena met his gaze steadily. Is that wise?
You've built relationships with these people over years.
Why risk everything for someone you barely know?
It was a fair question, and one Nailnish had been asking himself since deciding to save her life. The practical answer was that she represented valuable intelligence about the corruption they were fighting. But he knew that wasn't the whole truth. Because you remind me why I began this fight, he said finally. It's easy to forget, when you spend years living between two worlds, why justice matters more than survival.
You chose to risk everything to help people you had never met, people your own culture taught you to fear. That kind of courage is rare. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames.
When she spoke again, her voice was soft but firm. I keep thinking about those Apache families, wondering if children are going hungry tonight because of the supplies that were diverted. I think about my students at the fort, and what kind of future they'll have if men like Brennan are allowed to continue their schemes. And I think about all the other Sarah Morrisons who might discover something they shouldn't know, and whether anyone will be brave enough to save them. That's why we're going to succeed, Nailnish said with quiet conviction. Not just in exposing Whitmore and Brennan, but in proving that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous the fight becomes. As the fire burned low and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion across the desert sky, Elena Sandoval prepared for sleep in her new life. Tomorrow would bring them to the hidden camp where her ultimate fate would be decided. But tonight, for the first time since overhearing that fatal conversation, she felt something that surprised her. She felt hope. The hidden camp revealed itself gradually, like a secret the desert chose to share only with those worthy of trust. Elena had been riding for 3 hours through what appeared to be empty wilderness when Nailnish suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. She looked around but saw nothing except the endless maze of red sandstone formations and sparse desert vegetation that had surrounded them all morning. Then, she heard it. A sound so soft it might have been wine through stone, but with a rhythm that spoke of human presence. Nailnish cupped his hands around his mouth and produced a call that perfectly mimicked a canyon wren's song. The response came from 3 different directions, confirming that they were being watched by sentries Elena had never detected.
We wait, Nailnish said simply, dismounting and leading his horse to a patch of shade beneath an overhanging cliff.
They will decide whether we are welcome. Elena followed his lead, trying to calm her racing heart. Everything she had worked toward for the past 4 days came down to the next few minutes. If the Apache band rejected her presence, if they saw her as too great a risk to their security, then her transformation from Sarah Morrison to Elena Sandoval would end in failure and, almost certainly, death. The wait stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Then, without any sound to announce their approach, 3 Apache warriors materialized from the landscape itself. Elena blinked and they were simply there, as if the desert had shaped them from stone and shadow. The leader was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his long black hair and scars on his hands that spoke of countless battles. His dark eyes studied Elena with an intensity that seemed to penetrate directly to her soul, evaluating not just her appearance but something much deeper. Nailnish spoke in rapid Apache, his tone respectful but confident. Elena caught only fragments of what he was saying, but she heard her new name and what sounded like explanations about the corruption at Fort Apache. The conversation continued for several minutes, with the three warriors asking questions and Nailnish providing answers that seemed to satisfy their concerns. Finally, the leader turned his attention directly to Elena. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English. "I am Geronimo's cousin, Taklashim. Nailnish tells me you are a white woman who has chosen to die rather than serve the men who steal from our children. Is this true?" Elena met his gaze steadily, remembering Nailnish's advice about the importance of actions over words. "It is true," she replied simply. "I discovered that Colonel Whitmore and Thomas Brennan are selling your tribe's supplies and using the resulting hunger to justify removing all Apache from the reservation. When I tried to expose them, they sentenced me to death. Nailnish saved my life, and now I want to help gather evidence that will destroy them." Taklashim studied her for another long moment. "You understand that coming here means you can never return to your old life? That if the soldiers discover this place, we will all die fighting?" "I understand," Elena said. "Sarah Morrison is dead. I am Elena Sandoval now, and my loyalty is to justice, not to the corrupt men who wear the American flag while betraying everything it should represent." Something in Taklashim's expression shifted, though Elena couldn't quite read the change. He spoke again to Nailnish in Apache, then gestured for them to follow. As they mounted their horses and began moving deeper into the canyon, Elena realized that her first test had been passed, but many more awaited. The camp itself was a marvel of adaptation and concealment. Built into a series of natural caves and sheltered alcoves carved by centuries of wind and water, it was virtually invisible from more than 50 yards away. The entrances were hidden behind carefully arranged boulders and scrub brush, while the living areas extended deep into the rock formations where cookfires would produce no visible smoke. Elena estimated that perhaps 40 people lived in this hidden refuge, ranging from elderly grandparents to children who had never seen the reservation their parents remembered. The women watched her arrival with cautious curiosity, while the men evaluated her with the practical attention of warriors assessing a potential threat. The children, however, showed the universal fascination of young people encountering something completely new to their experience. Taklashim led them to a central area where the band's leaders were gathered around a small fire. Elena recognized immediately that this was a formal council meeting, convened to decide her fate. Nailnish had warned her that such decisions were never made quickly or casually among the Apache. Every voice would be heard, every concern addressed, before the group reached consensus. "Sit," Taklashim instructed, gesturing to a spot across the fire from the assembled elders. "Tell us again why we should trust a white woman with the location of our families." Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether she lived or died. But she also knew that honesty was the only currency that would have value in this setting. "You shouldn't trust me," she began, surprising them with her directness. "I am white, I was raised by people who believe your culture is inferior to theirs, and I have no proof except my word that my intentions are honorable. You should be suspicious of me, just as you would be suspicious of any stranger who appeared in your midst claiming to want to help." The elders exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such candor. Elena continued. "But I ask you to judge me by my actions, not my words. Give me tasks that will prove my commitment. Let me show you that I can contribute to your survival rather than threaten it. And if at any point you decide I am a liability, deal with me as you would any other threat to your people's safety." An elderly woman who had been silent until now leaned forward and spoke in Apache. Nailnish translated for Elena's benefit. "Grandmother Ayana asks what skills you possess that might be useful to us. She says the desert has no patience for people who cannot contribute to the group's survival." Elena had been preparing for this question since beginning her journey. "I can read and write in English and Spanish. I understand government bureaucracy and legal procedures. I know how to organize and teach, and I learn quickly. Most importantly, I have connections in the white world that might be valuable for gathering intelligence about future threats to your people." The council session continued for over an hour, with various elders asking probing questions about Elena's background, motivations, and understanding of what she was asking to join. Through it all, she tried to project the same calm determination she had shown when facing down those soldiers who made crude comments about Apache women. Finally, Taklashim called for a private discussion among the elders. Elena and Nailnish were asked to wait outside the circle while the leaders debated her fate in voices too low to overhear. Elena tried to read their faces and body language, but Apache culture valued emotional restraint too highly for her to gain much insight from their expressions. When the council reconvened, Taklashim announced their decision with formal ceremony. "You will be given a trial period of 1 full moon," he said. "During this time, you will live as one of us, contributing to the work that keeps us alive and learning our ways. Grandmother Ayana will be your teacher in women's responsibilities. Nailnish will continue to guide your education in desert survival and Apache customs." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "But, understand this, if at any time we determine that your presence endangers this band, you will be executed immediately. This is not cruelty but necessity. Too many lives depend on our security for us to take chances with potential threats." Elena nodded her acceptance of these terms. "I understand, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to prove myself worthy of your trust." As the formal council session ended and the elders dispersed to their daily activities, Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had passed the first hurdle, but now came the much greater challenge of actually living up to the promises she had made. She would have to learn skills she had never needed, adapt to social customs completely foreign to her upbringing, and prove every day that she was committed to the band's survival. Grandmother Ayana approached her as the gathering broke up, her weathered face showing more curiosity than hostility. She was a small woman, probably in her 70s, but she moved with the quick grace of someone who had never stopped working. Her English was limited but functional. "Come," she said simply. "You learn now." The next few weeks passed in a blur of intensive education unlike anything Elena had experienced in her privileged Eastern upbringing. Grandmother Ayana proved to be a demanding but patient teacher, showing Elena how to gather and prepare the desert plants that formed much of the band's food supply. She learned to identify the various cactus fruits and nuts, to find water-storing plants during dry periods, and to prepare traditional foods that could sustain travelers on long journeys. The work was physically demanding and often tedious, requiring the kind of manual labor Elena had never needed to perform. Her hands, soft from years of handling nothing more challenging than books and writing materials, became calloused and tough from digging roots and processing tough plant fibers. Her fair skin, despite her attempts to protect it, darkened under the constant desert sun. But more challenging than the physical demands were the social and cultural adjustments Elena had to make. Apache society operated according to complex rules of kinship, respect, and reciprocity that were completely different from the hierarchical structures she had grown up with. Everyone had specific roles and responsibilities that contributed to the group's survival, and individual desires were always subordinated to collective needs. Elena quickly learned that asking too many questions was considered rude, that certain topics could only be discussed by specific people at appropriate times, and that the elaborate courtesy she had been taught in Boston was less valued than practical competence and emotional restraint. She had to relearn how to interact with people, how to show respect, and how to contribute to group decisions without overstepping cultural boundaries. The children of the band were often her best teachers, showing her with patient demonstration what adults might expect her to learn through observation alone. They taught her Apache words and phrases, corrected her pronunciation with gentle laughter, and included her in the daily tasks that kept the camp running smoothly. Most importantly, Elena began to understand the profound connection between the Apache people and the desert landscape they called home. This wasn't simply a matter of survival skills or practical knowledge, but a spiritual and emotional bond that shaped every aspect of their lives. The land wasn't something to be conquered or controlled, but a living entity that demanded respect, understanding, and careful stewardship. As her trial period progressed, Elena found herself changing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The rigid social expectations that had shaped her behavior in Boston began to feel artificial and constraining when compared to the Apache emphasis on practical contribution and authentic character. The elaborate dresses and complex hairstyles that had once seemed essential to her identity now struck her as unnecessary complications that interfered with the real work of living. More profoundly, she began to understand why her presence represented such a risk to the band's security. Their survival depended on remaining invisible to the outside world, on being dismissed by white authorities as scattered remnants of a defeated people. If the army discovered that they maintained a sophisticated intelligence network and harbored fugitives from American justice, the retaliation would be swift and merciless. This knowledge made Elena even more determined to prove that she could contribute something valuable enough to justify the danger she represented. She threw herself into learning not just survival skills but the complex web of relationships and obligations that held Apache society together. She memorized the names and kinship connections of every person in the band, studied the spiritual beliefs and ceremonial practices that gave meaning to their lives, and gradually earned acceptance as someone who understood and respected their way of life. But the real test of her commitment came when Nailnish announced that he had received intelligence about a new threat to Apache people throughout the territory. Colonel Whitmore and Thomas Brennan had accelerated their timeline, using Elena's supposed death as justification for increased military pressure on the reservation. They were claiming that the murder of a senator's daughter proved the futility of peaceful coexistence with Apache people, and they were pushing for immediate forced relocation. "They're using my death to justify exactly what I tried to prevent," Elena said when Nailnish shared this information with her and the council. "How many innocent people will suffer because of what they're claiming I represent?" Taklashim studied her with the same intensity he had shown during her first day in the camp. "This news troubles you greatly," he observed. "It should trouble all of us," Elena replied. "Every day we wait gives them more time to build support for their plans. We need to find a way to expose their corruption before they succeed in removing every Apache from the territory." "And how do you propose we do that?" asked Grandmother Ayana. "We cannot simply walk into the white man's courts and present our evidence. Who would believe the word of people they consider savages?" Elena had been thinking about this problem for weeks, and she believed she had found a possible solution. "There's a man in Washington, a journalist named Harrison Curtis, who has written articles criticizing government treatment of Indian tribes. If we could get him proof of what Whitmore and Brennan are doing, he has the connections and credibility to expose them." "This would require leaving the safety of the camp," Nailnish pointed out. "It would mean taking enormous risks to gather the kind of evidence that white authorities would accept." "Yes," Elena agreed. "It would be dangerous for all of us. But what's the alternative? We can hide here indefinitely, but that doesn't stop the suffering of the people on the reservation. And eventually, they'll find us anyway." The council session that followed lasted until dawn, as the elders weighed the risks of action against the dangers of continued inaction. In the end, they reached a decision that would test everything Elena had learned about Apache culture and her own capacity for courage. They would send her back into the white world, armed with evidence and intelligence gathered by Nailnish's network, to expose the corruption that threatened not just the Apache but the integrity of American justice itself. It was a mission that would require her to become Sarah Morrison again, at least long enough to make contact with people who could help. And it would mean putting everything they had all worked for at risk on the chance that one honest journalist could make a difference. As Elena prepared for what might be her final test, she realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer the sheltered schoolteacher who had overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. She had become someone who understood that some fights were worth any sacrifice, and some causes were worth dying for. The desert had taught her its lessons well. Now she would find out if she was strong enough to use what she had learned. The plan to expose Colonel Whitmore and Thomas Brennan required Elena to do something that terrified her more than facing hostile warriors or surviving in the desert. She had to return from the dead. 3 months had passed since Sarah Morrison's supposed murder, and the story of her death had taken on a life of its own. Elena learned from Nailnish's intelligence network that her father, Senator Morrison, had used his daughter's tragic fate to push for harsher military action against Apache tribes. Colonel Whitmore had been promoted for his handling of the crisis, and Thomas Brennan had acquired several thousand acres of former Apache land at bargain prices. The corruption had succeeded beyond their worst fears, and Elena's death had become the justification for everything she had tried to prevent. But their very success had also made them careless. They believed the only witness to their conspiracy was buried somewhere in the desert, and they had begun to operate more openly, creating the kind of evidence trail that could destroy them if it fell into the right hands. Elena's mission was to become Sarah Morrison just long enough to make contact with Harrison Curtis, the Washington journalist who specialized in exposing government corruption. But, first, she had to gather proof that would convince him her story was true. This meant returning to Fort Apache and its surrounding areas, places where her face was known and her supposed death was accepted fact. The transformation back to her old identity required more than changing clothes and hairstyles. Elena had to remember how to move like a pampered Eastern lady rather than someone who had learned to read the desert's dangers. She had to soften the calluses on her hands and lighten her sun-darkened skin as much as possible. Most challenging of all, she had to suppress the calm confidence she had developed living with the Apache and rediscover the nervous energy that had characterized Sarah Morrison. "You've changed more than you realize," Nailnish observed as he watched her practice walking in the long skirts and tight shoes she had abandoned months ago. "You move differently now, think differently. Even your voice has changed." He was right. The desert had burned away layers of artifice Elena hadn't even known she carried. The woman who emerged from that experience was stronger, more direct, and less concerned with social expectations than the schoolteacher who had first overheard Whitmore's conspiracy. "Will that make me more convincing or less?" she asked, struggling with the corset that had once seemed like normal attire. "More," Nailnish said without hesitation. The Sarah Morrison who disappeared was frightened and uncertain. The woman who returns will have the strength to face whatever she finds. The first phase of their plan took Elena to a small town called Esperanza, 50 miles southeast of Fort Apache. According to Nailnish's contacts, this was where Thomas Brennan had established a temporary headquarters for his land development schemes. More importantly, it was where he kept the records that would prove the illegal diversion of Apache supplies and the manipulation of government policies. Elena arrived in Esperanza on a Tuesday morning in late November, traveling by stagecoach under the identity of Elena Sandoval, a Mexican woman seeking work as a translator and clerk. The town was busy with the kind of frantic activity that marked boom settlements, full of speculators, developers, and opportunists hoping to profit from the opening of former Apache lands. Brennan's operation was headquartered in the largest building on the main street, a hastily constructed structure that served as both office and warehouse. Elena spent 2 days observing the building's routines, noting when people came and went, identifying which employees might be vulnerable to bribery or manipulation. Her breakthrough came when she overheard 2 clerks complaining about unpaid wages. Brennan apparently had a habit of delaying salary payments when he was short of immediate cash flow, a practice that created resentment among his lower-level employees. Elena saw an opportunity and approached the younger of the 2 men, a nervous accountant named Frederick Mills who seemed desperately worried about his financial situation. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about wages," she said, intercepting him as he left the building that evening. "Perhaps we could discuss a way for you to earn some extra money." Mills looked around nervously, clearly aware that such conversations could be dangerous. "What kind of work are you talking about?" "I represent certain interests in Mexico City who are concerned about American land development along the border," Elena said, using a story she and Nailnish had carefully crafted. "We need information about which properties are being acquired and what development plans are being made. Nothing treasonous or illegal, just business intelligence that would help us protect our own investments." The lie came easily, supported by Elena's ability to speak Spanish and her genuine knowledge of Mexican business practices gained from her grandmother's stories. Mills listened with growing interest as she explained that she could pay him $50 for copies of key documents from Brennan's files. $50 represented nearly 2 months' salary for a clerk like Mills, and Elena could see him wrestling with temptation and fear. She pressed her advantage carefully. "I understand your caution," she said. "But, consider this, if Mr. Brennan fails to pay the wages he already owes you, what loyalty do you owe him in return? And, if his business practices are completely honest,
then, the documents I'm asking for should contain nothing that would embarrass him. That last comment struck home.
Mills had been working for Brennan long enough to have suspicions about some of the transactions he was processing.
Elena's offer gave him a way to earn money while potentially protecting himself if Brennan's schemes eventually collapsed.
3 days later, Mills handed Elena a leather portfolio containing copies of contracts, correspondence, and financial records that documented the scope of Brennan's corruption in devastating detail. The papers showed how Apache supply contracts had been systematically diverted, how government officials had been bribed to expedite land transfers, and how the timing of military actions had been coordinated with Brennan's acquisition plans. Most damning of all were several letters between Brennan and Colonel Whitmore discussing the need to eliminate the Morrison problem and ensure that no witnesses remained to complicate our arrangements. While the letters didn't explicitly order Elena's murder, they made clear that both men understood what was being planned and approved of the solution. Armed with this evidence, Elena began the most dangerous part of her mission. She had to travel to Tucson and then to the territorial capital, where she could access the telegraph system needed to contact Harrison Curtis in Washington. But she also had to avoid detection by any of Brennan's associates or Army personnel who might recognize her. The journey to Tucson required 3 days of careful travel, staying away from main roads and avoiding towns where she might be recognized. Elena had learned enough about desert survival to make the trip safely, but the constant vigilance required was exhausting. Every distant dust cloud might represent writers searching for her, every stranger might be someone who remembered Sarah Morrison's face from wanted circulars.
In Tucson, Elena faced her greatest test yet.
She had to transform back into Sarah Morrison completely, becoming the dead woman long enough to convince Harrison Curtis that her story was worth investigating. This meant abandoning the Elena Sandoval identity that had protected her and embracing all the risks that came with returning from the dead. The telegraph Curtis received in his Washington office must have been startling in its simplicity: Sarah Morrison alive. Have proof of corruption involving Apache supplies and land fraud. Need protection and media coverage. Can you help? Curtis's response came within hours: if you are who you claim to be, meet me at the Territorial Hotel in Phoenix. Bring documentation. Exercise extreme caution. The meeting with Curtis took place in a hotel room overlooking Phoenix's dusty Main Street, with Elena taking every precaution to ensure she wasn't followed. Curtis proved to be a thin, intense man in his 40s with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent years investigating corruption in high places. He listened to Elena's story with professional skepticism, frequently interrupting to ask probing questions that tested the consistency of her account. But, when she produced the documents obtained from Brennan's office, Curtis's demeanor changed dramatically. He spread the papers across the hotel room's table, studying them with the expertise of someone who understood exactly what they represented. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, examining a letter that showed Brennan arranging the sale of Apache beef supplies to civilian contractors. "These documents prove systematic fraud on a scale that could bring down a dozen officials. Can you publish the story?" Elena asked. "Will people believe it?" Curtis looked up from the papers with a grim smile. "Miss Morrison, this isn't just a story. This is evidence of federal crimes that could result in prison sentences for everyone involved. But publication won't be enough. We need to get this information to federal authorities who have the power to investigate and prosecute." The next several hours were spent planning a campaign that would expose the corruption while protecting Elena from retaliation. Curtis had contacts in Washington who could ensure the evidence reached honest officials, but getting Elena to safety would require careful coordination with federal marshals who operated independently of the territorial government. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Elena would travel to Washington under federal protection, where she would testify before a congressional committee investigating territorial corruption. Curtis would publish a series of articles that would make her story national news and prevent Brennan and Whitmore from eliminating the evidence by eliminating her. But, first, they had to get her out of Arizona territory alive. The journey east began at dawn the following morning, with Elena traveling in a heavily guarded federal carriage accompanied by 2 deputy marshals who had been specially assigned to ensure her safety. The trip to the railroad depot in El Paso would take 4 days, during which Elena would be vulnerable to attack from Brennan's hired guns or military personnel loyal to Colonel Whitmore. They had been traveling for less than 6 hours when the attack came.
Elena was dozing in the afternoon heat when gunfire erupted around their carriage.
She jerked awake to see one of the deputy marshals slump forward with blood spreading across his chest. The second marshal was already returning fire, shouting for Elena to get down as bullets shattered the carriage windows. "Stay low," the surviving marshal yelled as he tried to control the panicking horses.
"We've got company and they're not here to talk."
Through the chaos, Elena could see at least 6 mounted men attacking from both sides of the trail. They were shooting to kill, not trying to capture her alive, which meant Brennan had decided that dead witnesses were safer than imprisoned ones. The running fight continued for over a mile, with the marshal managing to keep the carriage moving despite multiple hits from the attackers. Elena found herself thinking with the clarity that danger had taught her during her months with the Apache. She located the spare pistol the dead marshal had been carrying and checked its ammunition, preparing to fight for her life if necessary. The end came suddenly, when their carriage rounded a bend and ran straight into a roadblock. A fallen tree blocked the path ahead, while armed men emerged from cover on both sides. The surviving marshal managed to kill 2 more attackers before a rifle bullet took him down, leaving Elena alone against impossible odds. She was preparing to make her final stand when the sound of Apache war cries split the desert air. Nelnish and 5 Apache warriors burst from concealment behind the attackers, turning the ambush into a 3-way battle. Elena watched in amazement as the man who had saved her life months ago materialized like an avenging spirit to save her again. The fight was brief but decisive. Caught between the carriage and the Apache warriors, Brennan's gunmen never had a chance to reorganize. Within minutes, the shooting was over and the desert was quiet except for the moaning of wounded men.
"Are you hurt?"
Nelnish asked as he reached the carriage, his eyes scanning Elena for injuries. "I'm fine," she replied, though her hands were shaking from the aftermath of violence.
"How did you know to find me here?" "I've been shadowing your journey since you left Tucson," Nelnish said.
"I knew Brennan wouldn't let you reach Washington alive. The Apache Council decided you were too valuable to lose." As they helped the wounded marshal and prepared to continue the journey under Apache protection, Elena realized that her story had become something larger than one woman's quest for justice. The corruption she had discovered represented a fundamental betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for in its treatment of Native peoples. Exposing it would require courage from people of all backgrounds who understood that some principles were worth fighting for. The train that carried Elena Morrison back to Washington also carried the documentation that would destroy Thomas Brennan's empire and send Colonel Marcus Whitmore to federal prison. Harrison Curtis's articles, published in newspapers across the country, sparked a congressional investigation that revealed corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. But, for Elena, the real victory wasn't in the courtrooms or newspaper headlines. It was in the message she carried back to Washington about the Apache people she had come to know and respect. They weren't the savage enemies portrayed in government reports, but families trying to survive in an impossible situation, people with complex cultures and sophisticated societies who deserved the same basic human dignity accorded to all Americans. The schoolteacher from Boston had died in the Arizona desert, just as Colonel Whitmore had planned. But the woman who emerged from that experience had learned something precious about the connection between justice and courage, about the price of survival and the value of truth. Elena Morrison returned to Washington a different person than the one who had left it, carrying scars from the desert sun and knowledge bought with blood. She had seen the worst of what humans could do to each other, but she had also witnessed the kind of courage that made hope possible even in the darkest circumstances. The man who had been hired to kill her had instead taught her how to live. And that, perhaps, was the most remarkable transformation of all. In the months that followed, as trials proceeded and justice was slowly served, Elena often thought about the hidden